feel so bad about it. I saw the maps of Nepal and India. Here is a map of the Philippines. It's rather stretched out. But downward is the island of Mindanao and 3 main islands in the Philippines. On the north side is the Luzon, the main island where Manila, the capital, is found. And in the center is the Visayas Islands. And at the southern part is Mindanao, where much of the conflict that is happening or that you hear about is taking place. However, in the Philippines there is a much more complex conflict situation. The dynamics are that there have been protracted armed conflicts that have been taking place for over 40 years. There is a communist insurgency led by the Communist Party of the Philippines and its political umbrella organization, the National Democratic Front, and its armed wing is the New People's Army. And in this previous map that I'm showing you, those red dots are the areas of the Philippines where there are guerrilla fronts of the NPA, the New People's Army. On the other hand, in the southern Philippines, there are 2 main guerrilla groups: the Moro National Liberation Front, which began the rebellion against the government in the late 60s, and its splinter group, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. It split from the Moro National Liberation Front when the MNLF, they had ideological differences because the MNLF had come to accept the Philippines as a possible response to the armed conflict, and the MILF continued to pursue independence. In the southern Philippines, Mindanao, apart from the organized armed groups, there are other, for example, the Abu Sayyaf group. I don't know if any of you have heard about this. This is a kidnap for ransom group that has held, well, it espouses Islamic ideas, but its main activities have been to kidnap people for ransom. And the latest one that's hit the headlines are they had captured 3 workers of the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross. And they've released 2, but there's one, a Swiss national that has remained for about 5 months. Of course, well, in Mindanao there are big clans, warlord clans, and also now that engage in what we call RIGO. These are clan wars that mainly sometimes is over land that they have these fights. The indigenous peoples are really the most affected. Mindanao has a big population of what we call the nomads, or the indigenous peoples that occupy the sort of the highlands that more often than not get caught in these conflicts that I mentioned earlier. This is Mindanao and how it would represent. This is separate from the Philippine map now, where the Moro Rebellion, Moro refers to the Muslim secessionist groups, go downward from what we call the ARMM, the Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, that's in green, downward to Sulu and Basilan, where the Abu Sayyaf operates. The red, CPP, NPA, NDF, of the communist group, it's not, like I said earlier, it's not fully covering all those areas. It's just that we couldn't color it well. These are just guerrilla, where the guerrilla fronts are in those provinces. And as mentioned earlier, the indigenous peoples are along the mountainous sides and are affected by the conflict as well. I'd like to begin with the historical background of the conflict in Mindanao. It is what we call a sovereignty-based rebellion, because long before the period of the conquest of the Spanish and the Americans of our occupation of our country, there were 2 sultanates that existed. They were the approximated nation states. They had governance structures, they had trade, they have very pronounced identities and cultural characteristics. This is the Sultanate of Mindanao, the red, that is central Mindanao. And there's a pink area that says Sobu's Sultanate. Actually, that pink thing would extend to the other side of the wall, but it's just the way it brings the maps. But there were two main sultanates at the time of the arrival of the conquistas from Spain and America. Afterwards, America, we had 340 years of colonization by the Spanish, and then afterwards, I don't know, the Americans. And another 3 years of Japanese occupations in the soils. That's the way we evolved as a country. But the reasons for the causes for the conflict in Mindanao are really the historical injustice that had happened from the marginalization of the indigenous populations from their lands. The Spanish and the Americans had introduced land laws that we had not known before, the Regalian Doctrine, that introduced titling of lands where there were none amongst the indigenous populations. And the practice was carried on through after we had the Commonwealth and Philippine-led governments, which had adopted migration policies that had allowed the takeover by settlers from the North, Luzon, and Visayas of the regions of the Philippines to settle in Mindanao. It was then called the land of promise. And there were slogans that were saying, "Go south, young man," because that's where all of the riches were. Meantime, these people didn't know about titling backwards. This changed the cultural and ethnic balance in Mindanao, so that the settler population became the larger, and the indigenous populations got sent back. There have been in the history of Mindanao assertions of identity and cultural integrity. And sometime in the 60s, this became pronounced with the Mindanao independence movement. It's a movement of big Muslim families in central Mindanao grew. But the armed struggle really began with the MNLF in 1968. From the time of 1968 up to present, this is a conservative estimate of 130,000 deaths. This is a government estimate, but others say it's more. At the time of the peak and escalation of the conflict between the MNLF and the government, I would jump to the peace process now that had been initiated at the time of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Embarked on a peace process with the MNLF that resulted in an initial peace agreement in Tripoli, the Tripoli Agreement of 1976, brokered by the Organization of Islamic Conference, or OIC, particularly main role for Mr. Gaddafi in Libya. At the time that he was trying to sort of shift from his reputation and become sort of in the Muslim world become a peace builder. The 1976 Tripoli Agreement provided from the original MNLF claim of having the entire Mindanao under their control, administrative control, 13 provinces only. They wanted it declared a Bangsa Moro Republic. Bangsa means nation, and Moro Muslims. They wanted it to be declared a Bangsa Moro Republic, but Marcos had negotiated an autonomous region under the sovereignty and within the territorial integrity of the Republic of the Philippines. The MNLF forces would join forces with the armed forces of the Philippines, that is the AFP. But there was a totality clause in this agreement that said the entire agreement will be implemented in accordance with constitutional processes. Following